5th anniversary year, I'd like to point out that for decades, we've engaged with the state legislature, with the various state agencies, the Railroad Commission, Public Utility Commission, Texas Center for Environmental Quality, Texas Department of Agriculture, and 4 or 5 different incarnations of what is now the State Energy Conservation Office, and been involved in task forces and study groups and advisory councils and the deliberative polling process, which laid the groundwork for a lot of what we see today. A lot of you may remember that, some of you may not. But that's ancient history. It did lay the groundwork. But I would like to mention more recent history, particularly legislative history. In 1999, with the electric utility deregulation, renewable energies portfolio standard, or the goal for renewable energy, was established in Texas. And in 2005, we worked aggressively to help expand that from the original 2,000 megawatts to 5,000 megawatts, and included the 500 megawatt non-wind target. Again, a topic that many of you are familiar with. In even more recent history, in 2009, 11, and 13, those legislative sessions, TREIA supported some 40 different bills which passed. Now, granted, many of those bills were periphery, not very directly involved, but a significant number of them were important directly for the development of renewables. And all 14 bills that TREIA opposed during those 3 legislative sessions were defeated. And here are some of the highlights. Positive adjustments to Chapter 313, which many of you know as being a very powerful project development tool for renewables in Texas, constantly under debate at the legislature. And we supported and I think were instrumental in helping Chapter 313 remain a powerful tool. Higher education institutions now are able to establish student fees to fund campus environmental and renewable energy projects. And a couple of campuses have done that. Others, hopefully, when they know about it, will do the same. This is a very positive thing because young people coming up in the educational world will see examples of renewable energy on their own campuses and help establish a positive image in their minds and an interest. Net metering, which was passed by the legislature for El Paso's electric territory only, significant restrictions on homeowners associations' prohibitions from putting solar on people's homes, another prime example of a very positive move. Third-party ownership of distributed renewable energy generation. And property assessed clean energy, or PACE, allowed for commercial and industrial facilities. Those are some examples of some of the positive things that we've been engaged in the most recent legislative sessions. Amongst the defeated bill highlights, there were several attempts to gut or eliminate Chapter 313 completely. Several attempts to restrict wind project development, particularly on siting issues. Attempts at unfavorable modifications to the Homeowners Association law. A very controversial law in some circles, and a lot of effort to try to overturn it. Efforts to repeal the state's goal for renewable energy. That was the one we passed in 1999 as part of the deregulation, and has already been completed and exceeded, if you will. And even to try to overturn in some form or fashion the CREZ law, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones law, which now has been fully implemented. The lines involved in that are completed. And even the elimination of the state's property tax, franchise tax, and fuel use tax exemptions for renewables, which were passed back in the early to mid-1980s. So one of the things that I was asked to address, in addition to looking forward to the legislative session, and my choice to look backwards somewhat, were the interim charges between this most recent 2013 legislative session and the upcoming 2015 session, in which the House and Senate committees are given tasks to undertake during that interim period to kind of set the stage, if you will, for the upcoming session. And I'd like to review the ones which, as we look at the various committees we're engaged with through the session, have some degree of interest potentially for the renewable energy industry. Early this year, going into the mid part of the year, these charges were rolled out on the House and Senate side. And there were a lot of charges that have absolutely nothing to do, of course, with renewable energy. And in fact, most of the charges that do have something potentially to do are, again, marginally so. The House Committee on Economic and Small Business Development, for example, had one of the charges which tried to keep an eye on, to review the current Texas Industry Cluster Initiative to determine if the state's targeted industry clusters need to be updated to reflect changes in industry sectors that have evolved in Texas since the clusters were initially identified. The reason that that might be important is that renewable energy is an industry sector and could be negatively or positively affected by any significant changes to how the Texas Industry Cluster Initiative is approached. In fact, I find no record of hearings at all held specifically addressing this charge. The House Committee on Energy Resources to study the impact of expanding oil and gas exploration and production occurring across the state, and many different elements that you see listed that have to do with the oil and gas exploration issue. The reason it's important to keep an eye on that, of course, is that what is done in relation to natural gas and oil exploration in the state does have a possibly even direct effect on the development of renewable energy, but certainly indirect effects that are important to understand. In fact, it occurs to me in looking at some of these elements, the effect on roads is a prime example. I recall that in the 2013 legislative session, while we were in one hearing room participating in a hearing to do something positive for renewable energy, which was being opposed as being state or government picking winners and losers and providing incentives, as we would prefer to call them, for the industry. Down the hall in another hearing room, a bill was being heard and eventually was passed, which put over $200 million of general revenue or general fund revenue from the taxpayers into the repair of roads in South Texas, primarily being destroyed or degraded by the activity in the Eagle Ford area where they were developing and fracking for natural gas. And granted, the natural gas industry puts money into funds to do road repair, but as I understand it, that money had been totally tapped out and this excess money was needed. If that's not an extra incentive or benefit, if you will, for that sector of the industry, I don't know what is. It's something that can be looked to and pointed at when making comparisons between the level of support and development of the different sectors of industry in the energy world when we confront them at the legislature. You see a second page of things that the Committee on Energy Resources covered, a complex relationship between landowners and royalty owners could peripherally have some impact on how solar projects are developed. Royalty owners and landowners have a perspective on how that's done based on their experience in the oil and gas industry, and they need access to minerals on their lands and their rights, and solar covers surface territory, and so there's some overlapping issues there to keep an eye on. But of all of these elements, They held 3 hearings, May, August, and September, and all were very, very focused and specific on oil and gas issues, and there was very little that I am aware of anyway that was a spillover into our interests. House Committee on Natural Resources. Changes focused primarily on water issues, including monitoring and updates on implementation of water bills from the 2013 session. Development of brackish water resources, enhanced aquifer storage, and permitting. How water is handled in the state continues to be an increasingly important element of the renewable energy industry's concerns, and as a tool for us to show a distinction between how renewable energy affects the population, the environment, et cetera, compared to other resources in their development process. And so keeping an eye on that is important. They held 2 hearings in June, focused on the implementation of the 2013 water bill, and once again, none of the issues that really overlap that much with renewable energy were discussed. The House Committee on Technology and House Committee on Ways and Means did some joint effort during the interim to review state regulatory and tax policy to ensure that investment in technology infrastructure, goods, and services is unfettered, and that Texas is able to capitalize on innovation to fuel additional job growth, business expansion, and investment. Anytime taxes and the way they're handled in the state is discussed, it's important, again, for the renewable energy sector to be aware of what's going on, because it opens up all sorts of both positive and negative opportunities. They held a hearing in April. Again, as far as I'm aware, no particular implications for renewables. On the Senate side, the Senate Business and Commerce Committee undertook a number of initiatives, and as far as I'm aware, no hearings were held directly on the issues that you see listed on this page. The last one, study areas of innovation in the electric market in Texas, including advancements of energy storage and efficient power dispatch to support use of renewable power and consider options to promote their effective use in Texas, was discussed in one hearing. Now that I think back on it, it just came to me, I remember that hearing was held. No particular legislative initiative was brought up in that hearing, as I recall. But it could result, any of these hearings for that matter, could result in legislation evolving from this, and it's hard to know for sure if that will be the case. The Senate Committee on Natural Resources study and make recommendations to encourage the use of brackish water. Again, the same set of issues, but also including desalination that was heard on the House side, or at least was to be discussed. No hearings were held directly on that particular issue that I can find in the record. So that leads us to the period following the interim studies and leading up to the election, which we have just gone through. And I know it's no secret how the elections turned out, but I think it might be helpful to kind of walk through the results of that, because it sets the stage for, obviously, the upcoming session. And before the election occurred in November, the University of Texas did one of their energy polls, which was a national poll, but it does have implications for Texas, that had some very interesting results. They were looking at how different age groups of voters were going to approach the election and what their issues were. And here's what they found. For some of the issues of interest to us, such as reducing carbon emissions, for those who are 35 years of age or younger, 68% supported reducing carbon emissions. But in the 65-plus age group, only 50%. Exporting natural gas, which if it is to occur, will have a significant impact potentially on the price of natural gas, which obviously has an impact on renewable energy. So the export of natural gas, should we or shouldn't we, those 35 and younger, 41% said yes, let's do that. 65 plus, only 22% wanted to see us doing natural gas export. Imposing a carbon tax, 43% of the 35 and below were in favor of that, only 22% of the older. Expanding financial incentives for renewables, 65% of the younger ones were in support, where only 48% of those 65 and older were. Decreasing use of coal, 57% of the younger, 33% only of those over 65. Requiring utilities to obtain a percentage of electricity from renewables, 62% of the younger people said, let's do that. Only 48% of the older ones. And then finally, expanding natural gas development, 56% of 35 and below, 63% 65 and above. So on that issue, everybody was tending back toward the direction of supporting something on both ends. Now, other polling elsewhere, as we led up to this election, showed that fewer than 35% of those 35 or under plan to vote. And greater than 60% of those over 60 plan to vote. So if you look at the numbers above in that first poll and you would say, hey, we're headed in the right direction here, this election is going to turn out pretty good for the issues we support in the renewable energy world. Look at how much support it's got for the 35 and below folks. But unfortunately, if they don't vote, that doesn't happen. And I think the elections and the statistics coming out of it show that that's the case.
And I have one question in the middle here, Russell. Are those voting blocks about the same size, the 65 plus and the 18-year-olds to 35, or is just with demographics, are there more voters than 65 plus?
I haven't gone into that level of detail on the whole survey to give you exacts, but my expectation, based on guessing, I guess, in a way, is that the polling was done on a balanced basis. You know, they probably didn't skew it one direction or the other. As far as the actual voting population goes, obviously we know that the younger population exceeds the older population, but the likely voters is the opposite. So I don't know if that answers the question. You'd have to go to the University of Texas and pull up their poll, and I don't have the link for that right now, but it could be found probably through UT. It's an interesting question, but it really doesn't really matter that much when you look at how the election went and you look at statistics that have been put out about the percentage of the age groups that voted. It answers the question, at least in my opinion. So the election itself, the Texas Legislature, how did it turn out? On the Texas Senate side, before the election on November the 3rd, the Democrat Party had 12 members, and the Republicans had 18, and there was one vacancy. There are 31 members of the Senate. The election ended up this way. 11 Democrats were elected, 20 Republicans, and there were 0 vacancies for a total of 31. But you see the number in parentheses to the right of the 0, and that 1 represents, if you drop down below, Senator Glenn Hagar, a Republican, who has announced that he will resign December the 5th, and that's because he was elected to higher office. So there will be a vacated position in a special election. And the result of that could change the numbers. How would it change it? Well, by dropping out, it reduces, at least temporarily, the Republican group to 19. And if the election goes to a Democrat, it would end up with 12 and 19. Or if it goes the other way, it'll be back to 11 and 20. In either case, the critical thing from a political standpoint is that the Democrats would still be one short, or let's put it this way, the Republicans would not have a two-thirds majority. And the two-thirds majority is a critical issue because the Senate rules, as they have existed for some time, is that it requires a two-thirds majority to bring a bill to the floor of the Senate. And that's a very powerful tool. The reality of the situation is that with new leadership on the Senate side, that rule is potentially in question. And it won't be the first time, but it's possible that the rules could be changed and a two-thirds majority would no longer be required in order to bring a bill to the floor, which would mean a major political shift in how things are done in the Senate. Now, it's not just a numbers issue, it's a who issue. Because on the Senate side, there were a number of changes. And through the years, there has been across-the-aisle support for renewable energy. For several legislative sessions, many of the bills that were filed by Republicans, or if they were filed by Democrats, were supported by Republicans. They could not have made it through the Senate otherwise. And some very positive things have happened as a result of that. But among the senators who are considered or have been considered the most supportive of renewable energy, and in fact were involved in authoring bills for renewables and in prominent positions on committees to help support bills, Senator Van de Putte, who everyone knows ran for lieutenant governor and did not make it, continues in the Senate because her term goes through 2017. Senator Wendy Davis, on the other hand, is gone. She ran for governor and failed, and her term was coming up. She would have had to run again. She couldn't, so she's out. Senator Corona, who has been very instrumental through the years and supportive of renewables, and Senator Dewell, also supportive, and chair of the Economic Development Committee, were both defeated in the Republican primaries. And Senator Robert Duncan, who is a longtime supporter of renewables, resigned. And of course, as I mentioned before, Senator Glenn Hagar is also gone because he will resign December the 5th. So the Senate rules change may have a stronger chance in occurring as a result of the shift of the nature of those who are elected this time around, because I think most will agree that those who will replace the ones I just mentioned who departed are probably a bit further to the right. Not that that necessarily means that they will oppose renewable energy, but historically the concept that seems to dominate is that government's involvement in these sorts of things is a very negative thing. It's an anti-government picking winners and losers, the standard things that we've heard over and over again coming into even stronger play. On the House side, before the election, Democrats had 55 seats, Republicans 94, and there was one vacancy. After the election, Democrats had 52 losing seats. The Republican Party was up to 98, and there was one vacancy. Again, you see the number to the right of that zero, which represents Representative Villarreal, a Democrat, who has announced that he will resign January 15th to run for the mayor of San Antonio. So the 52 Democrats will be reduced to 51 until a special election is held, in which case it could return to 52 and remain at 98 for the Republicans, or go the other way and be 99 Republicans and 51 Democrats. In either case, the Republicans will remain short of a 2/3 majority. So these are very tight numbers, and just as in the Senate, many of the individuals who in the past have been very supportive of renewables on both sides of the aisle have departed. Representative Strama, a Democrat, resigned earlier this year. Representative Island, a Republican, and Representative Hildebrand, also a Republican, who chaired House Ways and Means, which is a very important committee, chose not to run. Representative Gallego, a Democrat, and Representative Burnham, also a Democrat, were both defeated. Representative Gallego, in particular, had been a stalwart for renewable energy issues, as was Representative Villarreal, who is resigning, and of course Representative Strama and Burnham. Island and Hildebrand both have been positive in many cases on some of the proposed legislation and supported. So the changeover in those positions also has shifted, based on everything I can see, a bit further to the right. And the leadership of the House and the Senate is also changing, potentially. For sure on the Senate side, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who at this point in time it's hard to assess exactly how he's going to handle things, but if you follow the pundits, it's pretty clear that he's going to bring an agenda which is strong right, and again, very much in the government involvement in things not good viewpoint. On the Speaker's issue, on the Speaker of the House, Representative Joe Strauss has been Speaker for a couple of sessions at least, and he's being challenged this time by Representative Scott Turner from here in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. There are those who say that it's not a real strong possibility that he will be successful, but one never knows in today's political world. If I had to put odds on it, I would say that Speaker Strauss will continue to be Speaker. And most folks seem to agree that he is an even-handed, hand on the table, you know, he's fair. So looking at the legislature as a whole, I found a quote from a friend of Renewables, State Representative Drew Darby from San Angelo, who has a lot of reasons to be supportive of renewable energy, as well as oil and gas, obviously, with all of the wind activity in that region of the state and the very recent utility-scale solar activity around San Angelo. And here's what he said. There's going to be an inherent conflict between campaign rhetoric and actually getting something done. That will be the challenge facing the 84th. Do I really think we're going to get anything done? He asked rhetorically. No. We've got too many new players, too many egos, too many agendas, but I'm really hopeful that we can. Well, after saying, no, we're not going to get anything done, you have to be pretty hopeful to say you're pretty hopeful that we'll get things done. And he's talking about things in general, just moving things rather than being locked in to war amongst the parties. So here are the important legislative calendar dates coming up, or recently passed in the first case. November the 10th was the beginning of pre-filing of legislation. January 13th is when the session begins, and on March the 13th, that's the deadline for most bills to be filed. There's some exceptions, but the major bills will be filed by March the 13th. And June the 1st is the last day of the session. So if you're not familiar with the Texas Legislature, you will realize it's not a real long legislative session. And for those of you really not familiar with it, it only happens every other year. In addition to the legislative elections, of course, we had statewide offices. And this time around, as has been the case in recent times, all statewide elected officials are Republicans. But for the first time, perhaps ever, I don't know if this has ever occurred before, every statewide elected official will be a new elected official. So there's no old hands in control. Everybody's moved up or moved out, one or the other. And all of these state officials were elected with between 58 and 61% of the vote. Tell me that all of these state officials are not feeling a mandate. I think they will go into their positions at least saying that initially. Whatever agenda they had, they will believe the voters support. Other statewide offices. Of course, the governor's position, Greg Abbott, Attorney General Ken Paxton, State Comptroller Glenn Hagar, Land Commissioner George P. Bush, and Agricultural Commissioner Sid Miller. What to say about Governor Abbott? Hard to know how he's going to govern, but his political philosophy has been pretty much worn on his sleeve, I would say. And everybody knows that he's been very busy. He's even said he gets up every morning to sue the federal government. So there should be no question about his positions on government involvement. Attorney General Ken Paxton, again, probably the most farther to the right of those elected. State Comptroller Hagar, as I said, has been on the positive side of renewable energy development in some cases, and I would rate him as not hostile. Land Commissioner George P. Bush, I believe from my brief exposure to him, is somewhat pragmatic. And I do believe that he will steer the Land Commission on a continuing path as far as it goes related to renewables on behalf of the state. I think he'll follow some of the same direction that Commissioner Patterson took, but again, one never knows. Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller, not sure what to expect from him. The Agriculture Department in past years had been somewhat supportive of renewables. The previous commissioner, Commissioner Staples, started out his term in that office as being very interested in and very supportive of renewables, and that faded rather quickly as politics began to shift over the last 4 years, particularly the last 2 legislative sessions, to the point where the Agriculture Department has had no involvement or no support, basically, of renewables in any form or fashion. And based on the campaign which soon-to-be Commissioner Miller ran, I've spoken with people in the agricultural industry, and the indication that they give me is that he had very little to say about agriculture. That he pretty much focused his campaign on hot-button issues such as guns and abortion. And they're not real sure what to expect from him. And in some circles, there was a distinct lack of support from the agricultural community for him, which may somewhat hinder his ability to function. So let's get to what we can look forward to in the next legislative session, given the lay of the land, the direction that things seem to be going. As I've traveled around the state, I've had discussions with various groups in the industry in El Paso and Dallas and Houston and Austin and San Antonio, and from that, here's a list which I will call the wish list that I've seen coming from the industry. The desire for a statewide solar rebate. A solar RPS, which allows for renewable energy credit payments to be made to third-party financing companies. Pass some legislation to prevent utilities from assessing fees to renewable energy residential and commercial owners. Require tiered rate structure for utilities and cap or control high demand charges. Protecting net metering and requiring annual reconciliation in El Paso. Expanding net metering into other still regulated regions. A statewide annual net metering policy. Sales tax exemption for solar and other customer-side renewable energy devices like PV, solar water heaters, geothermal heat pumps, small wind generators. Pass a law encouraging community solar. Defend the Homeowners Association law and fix loopholes. Make refinements to the PACE law. Defend and or improve Chapter 313 and defend against American Legislative Exchange Council and others' efforts to repeal or negatively impact states' goal for renewable energy, CREZ, franchise tax, property tax, and fuel use tax exemptions. All things I mentioned earlier that had been attempted before. Among those, defending the Homeowners Association law and fixing loopholes rises, in my opinion, to the top of the list. But it is very risky to open up an issue like this, because once you open it up with a bill, it opens it up for all manner of both negative and positive efforts. And it was a hard-fought battle over a 6-year period of time to successfully pass the HOA law. On the positive side, the loophole that's being talked about primarily is the one which says that if a development is still in development, if a project is still in development, a housing project, and still under the developer's thumb instead of a separate HOA, that it can be exempted or is exempted from having to abide by the HOA law. And Mr. Bob Perry, who is at one time was the largest housing developer in the state, has passed away, and I don't know if that has any impact at all on the potential for this, but it is an issue to focus on. PACE refinements, a very complicated set of issues there. Implementing PACE as it currently exists is going to be the most important thing, just to get it underway. I'm not sure where things will go with that law. It'll be discussed. And of course, all of the defensive positions are the ones which are most likely to dominate. Then there's a whole regulatory front to deal with. Modifying power to choose the website in order to include distributed renewable generation excess power buyback programs. These are things which the industry is interested in and I think can be focused on and maybe some progress on. Promote increase in ERCOT tracking and reporting details under Project 42532, which is implementation now of the third-party ownership law, which was passed a couple of sessions ago. Stay engaged in resource adequacy. Maybe relook at energy market and capacity market issues if that's brought up again. Engage in the proposed EPA greenhouse gas rule, which is an ongoing issue, the 111D issue that many of you are aware of. Monitor the PUC development of 2015 report on the scope of competition in electric markets in Texas. That's PUC's biggest report pre-legislative session that sets the tone for what they think might need to be done. And in it will be their legislative recommendations. And those, at this time, in draft form, include securitizing utility stranded costs, which would be forced on the utilities outside of ERCOT that are still regulated and integrated by virtue of enforcing the proposed EPA greenhouse gas law. Doing something to restrict the further development of CREZ lines is on their agenda, or at least to try to control it and prevent it from opening things up more widely, I think, for renewables, frankly, than it currently is. CCNs for municipal utilities, where munis have been building power lines outside their territory because they're not covered by CCNs under the PUC rules. They'd like to restrict that to keep further transmission development from being done by munis. And here's one, setting up the repeal of the goal for renewable energy by saying we should give up the natural gas goal. In 1999, when the goal for renewable energy was established, the natural gas industry said, well, they got one, we should have one. So they got one passed, and it's been on the books ever since. A mandate which historically has been argued is not a good thing for government to do when focused on renewable energy. So it was never implemented because the use of natural gas exceeded the implementation point of the goal, and always has, and always will, in all likelihood. But now giving it up justifies eliminating the goal for renewable energy. That's the positioning that is coming from the PUC. The complete draft recommendations are available, as you see on the screen, at that link. And the hearings will continue, or the discussion from the hearings will continue, and then they'll put forth their final plan and their final recommendations. And then several bills have been filed to date, and we'll quickly go through them because none of them really directly affect renewables, but some could. Senate Bill 77, relating to the development of climate adaptation plan. All climate things can affect us in some way. Senate Bill 78, the state water plan, again, as I mentioned before, anything dealing with water can affect us. House Bill 79, exemptions from sales and use tax for certain entities. It's a very targeted bill, probably for one particular company, but it could set a precedent of some kind, so it's worth watching. House Bill 84, relating to the exclusion of certain funds and determining total revenue for franchise tax by taxable entities engaged in the business of harvesting trees for wood. I'm not sure what that's all about, but what else would you harvest trees for? I'm not sure. House Bill 190, relating to the regulatory analysis of rules proposed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, and that requires a cost-benefits analysis for any proposed environmental rule, and that's a slippery slope and a tricky one to watch. House Bill 224, relating to the name and governance of the Railroad Commission, changing it to the Texas Energy Resources Commission, which that's all it does, but it opens the door for any number of potential forms of mischief related to how energy in all its forms is handled and regulated in the state. And that's the end of my presentation. You see my website for TREIA there, and one correction, Scott Kornfeld's area code is not 612, it's 512, of course, the same as the TREIA number. So that's it, Rick.
Great, thank you very much, Russell. One question I had on slide 25, if you could just give the definition of the CCN for municipal utilities. What was the acronym CCN?
You know, you would ask that question. We haven't dealt with a CCN in a long time, but basically it's the permit process to proceed with an action. Okay. And I'm blanking out right now on what it stands for. It's been years because the regulated utilities have to go through that. And there haven't been a lot of CCN procedures in the last many years because there's not that many regulated utilities that have to come forward with them.
Okay. For those of you that have questions, please chat them into the lower right corner of your screen. You can send the question to all panelists if you want to ask Russell anything. to all participants if you want to share that information with the rest of the audience.
I have the answer to your question.
Okay, go ahead.
My mind has come back. It's a certificate of convenience and necessity.
Very good. And thanks for James, who also just chatted that in. So good job, James. Okay, the first question that came in was, is legislation needed to have utilities move to time-of-day pricing? If there was a market rate that was based on time-of-day pricing like they have in states like California, often the daytime rates of electricity could be double the nighttime rates, and that could help, particularly solar. So is there any legislation needed for time-of-day pricing?
You have to understand the utility structure in the state and realize that plus or minus 80% of the state is in a deregulated status. The rates for retail are set by the retailers. So if one were to try to pass a bill requiring them to institute a certain type of rate, I think it would run into a great deal of difficulty. In the regulated areas around El Paso and the Panhandle, the northeast and southeast corners that are still vertically integrated and regulated by the PUC, it's certainly possible that one could approach that and try to institute a rate for those, but it doesn't affect a significant portion of the state. Rate setting will be an issue, and there may be some legislation proposed. I frankly will have to get heads together with the people on our board who are more directly engaged in this to find out whether there is something there that might be pursued. Time-of-day rates could be instituted on their own for other reasons in the deregulated areas.
So like we've seen marketing campaigns say free electricity nights and weekends, so there's no legislature preventing it. You just said it'd be hard to have legislature
in the deregulated areas.
In the deregulated. Yeah. Okay. Next question was from Walter. Can you elaborate a little more on the challenges towards setting up a community solar program?
Well, that's something that's being undertaken by 2 municipal utilities in the state only at this point in time, CPS Energy and Austin Energy. And CPS has wrestled with that for some time, and they have a structure which I couldn't lay out to you right now, but I'm sure if you contacted CPS or went to their website, they may have enough detail to figure out how they did it. Umbrellaing anything like a community solar structure or whatever, again, over a state with as complex a utility structure as we have, would be no simple thing. It's something worth looking into. I think we'll explore it and see if there's something that can be done legislatively, but frankly, any kind of law that one tries to pass that would apply to the whole state of Texas, given the deregulated and still regulated and the co-ops and the munis and the mix that's out there, would be a very complex thing to do. And honestly, I can't tell you the detail.
Okay. The next question that came in was, what are the key groups that will be lobbying for renewable energy issues in the upcoming session? From Bruce. That's
a very good question. I'm not real sure. Historically, any number of environmental organizations have lobbied for renewables. TREIA has lobbied for renewables. The Wind Coalition has lobbied for renewables. And the Texas Solar Power Association, recently formed, will be lobbying for solar specifically. Wind, of course, the Wind Coalition lobbied specifically for wind. So it'll be a mix of organizations that are lobbying. Probably a lot of the same entities that always have. And there will probably be groups from the outside the state, like Vote Solar and the Solar Energy Industries Association. I'm pretty sure they will probably play in there somewhere. So does that answer the question?
I think so, yes. Next question was from Richard. Do you have recommendations how to reach residential developers, so those are the home developers, to survey them and encourage them not to exercise the prohibit solar option? Can we build and publish a list that identifies developers that allow solar and those that prohibit solar?
Well, you could do that if there was the resources to to do it, number one, and secondly, to get a response. Those who are hostile to it, let me put it this way, our experience in the years building up to the HOA deal, I said it was a 6-year process. That was at the legislature. It was several years before that on the part of TREIA of surveying homeowners associations and others to try to get a sense of exactly what the attitude was. And in spite of every effort, the number of HOAs that responded to anything was minuscule compared to the number of them that are out there. They have no compelling reason to want to respond to those sorts of things, and if they're opposed to it especially, it might be worth trying to do. Frankly, my guess is that unless a lot of very, very carefully done groundwork is laid and positioning done with developers in advance of a session, there's hardly a chance of getting something like that through, because there'll be a real negative reaction from the developers, and they've got a lot of power and resources to hold it off. Maybe there's a way to do it. It may take a while. It's not a one-session deal, probably, would be my guess.
All right. Next question is from Matt. What types of incentives, or I guess this means what market segments of incentives for renewables are most likely to pass in the Texas Legislature? And what he means by that, one's focused to the residential area, focused to the business scale, or towards the utility generator scale.
Well, if you're talking about specifically any kind of, quote, incentive on a, quote, statewide basis, the short answer is none. But at the legislature, anything can happen, okay? It's not entirely outside the realm of possibility that stars could align in a certain way and maybe something would pass, but the general feeling and understanding over there is that if anything, this session is going to be even more difficult than the last 2 sessions to get anything on a statewide basis to, quote, incentivize directly renewable energy. It was very difficult to even get a hearing in some cases on larger bills like that, much less get it to a floor and get it to a vote. The focus that TREIA had in the past sessions like that, as things got more and more difficult for renewables, was to focus on very targeted, specific tweaks, if you will, incremental improvements, as opposed to big picture incentive bills and that sort of thing. And I think that's probably still the case.
Okay, next question, and we have time for a couple more. What is the key to getting net metering instituted statewide in Texas?
This is just my opinion. I don't speak for TREIA on this. The board is meeting in December and also in January, and we'll discuss what issues it will get behind and so on. But I can tell you that the concept of statewide mandated net metering is highly unlikely. That's my opinion.
All right, question from Richard. In the past, there's been statewide incentives to consumers for propane. Is this still in place? And if so, is it worth bringing attention to?
I don't know whether there's still I'm not sure what the incentive was. There have been various and sundry types of incentives for fossil fuels for a long, long time. But history has shown us that pointing out, will they get it, hasn't really been a terribly successful strategy for us getting it. It's not an issue of equalization. It's an issue of political philosophy and ideology that drives a lot of the decisions around these issues. If it was simply a question of equality in treatment, we'd be in a totally different place today. So I don't know about propane. I don't know if they still get an incentive or not, but I doubt that it makes a whole lot of difference.
Okay, we have several questions that just came in about PACE. We'll probably answer those and then wrap up. My first question, Paige, so that was passed last time, but the implementation was left to the regional authorities, from my understanding. So has any county taxing authority actually implemented a PACE program that you're aware of, and what's been the experience?
They have not yet. No one has actually implemented one. The focus from the last several months had been on the regional councils of government. And there's been a lot of interest expressed on the part of the COGs, but they have been unable, to this point anyway, to pull the trigger on a program. Some of those COGs are in turmoil. One in particular, I think, the Alamo Area Council of Governments has gone through a huge transition in personnel and so on. So it's been very difficult. Individual counties, on the other hand, seem to maybe be the place where the first one or ones will actually happen on a countywide basis. And if I were to guess, I would say that there's a good chance maybe that Travis County will be the one to step up. But again, I don't know that for sure. Somebody's going to be the first one, and I think once somebody actually does it, it will open, I would hope, a floodgate, but it will certainly open a gate, and others will follow suit. It's always hard to be the first one to try something.
Okay, and so that should answer Timothy's question about the prospects of Texas approving and implementing a PACE program. So again, it was approved at the state level, but it's being implemented at the county level. And for Ann, who had asked about advocacy to implement PACE and what organization could join, I just sent out a link for a webinar we hosted, the Executive Director of Keeping PACE in Texas. You can see the recording of that webinar. You can also see a link to her website and organization, which is working in Austin, trying to coordinate with these regional governments. And also, I'd encourage you to work with your own taxing authority, whoever does the property taxes for your group. That would be the organization that would try to implement this. Now, that's all Russell, did you have anything else before we wrap up?
Well, I would just say that on PACE, a great deal of effort has gone into getting it ready to go. The PACE in a box took a longer time to develop than we thought it would, but that's because it involved all of the stakeholders, including the financial community on the private sector side, which is pretty unique in the country. And a great structure is there now, and all the details are there. It's just a matter of getting some entity that's willing to take that first step. And Charlene is definitely on the case, and working with PACE and keeping PACE in Texas is the thing to do. They need all the support they can get, because personnel to keep pushing this along has to be paid for somehow. And because there's no provision in the state law to pay for anybody to push this forward. It's all being done on an ad hoc or at least a semi-voluntary basis. Dozens and dozens of volunteers, including folks from TREIA, were involved in the committees developing PACE in a box, and it's well positioned, and we want to see it go forward. It just needs somebody, some entity, to step to the plate.
And for the audience, the PACE in a box it's a entire program that has been vetted and again discussed with multiple organizations, and at the local level, the counties could implement the program without having to try to spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. The PACE in the box took the experience from other states, what worked, what didn't work, and tried to put it together into a program that could be implemented very quickly. So if you're interested in more, again, look at the link that I sent. You can listen to the webinar from earlier this year with Charlene Heidinger. And also you can look at the Keeping PACE in Texas website, which is on the link to the webinar. That's all the time we have for today. So I wanted to thank Russell very much for coming back again. This is our third or fourth time we've had him. You could either spend all year long down in Austin butting your heads with politicians, or you can invite him to give a webinar for 1 hour. And we really prefer to have him for an hour every year. I hope you would support TREIA. The website is there. They have annual meetings, and you can join if you're in the industry. And also thanks to Principal Solar, who again funds the Principal Solar Institute. And you can find out more about us at www.principalsolarinstitute.org, about Principal Solar at principalsolar.com, and TREIA at www.TREIA.gov.